Hi, everybody. I'm doing AV and hosting at the same time. Sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Terrence. I'm the manager of 192 Books, and we are here to celebrate the publication of Peter N. Miller's The Weather on September 9th, 2001, published by MER Books. I'm going to do a quick introduction of Peter and Graham, and then we'll get into a conversation, a Q&A, and a book signing. The books are available up for sale here. Peter N. Miller is president of the American Academy in Rome. He was professor of cultural history and then dean at the Bard Graduate Center in New York City between 2001 and 2023. He is the author of a series of books on the early 17th century antiquarian Nicolas Fabry de Pereche, on the history of antiquarianism and on the modern study of objects as evidence. He co-curated Dutch New York between East and West, The World of Margaretha van Berck, Richard Tuttle, What is the Object, and Conserving Active Matter. His next book is on conservation as a human science, and that'll be from Princeton University Press this year. D. Graham Burnett works at the intersection of historical inquiry and artistic practice based in New York and associated with the Friends of Attention. He is interested in experimental and experiential approaches to textual material, pedagogical modes, and hermeneutic activities traditionally associated with the research humanities. Burnett trained in history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University and currently holds the Henry Charles Lee Professorship at Princeton University. A visiting artist at the Academy of Fine Arts in Helsinki, he runs the Conjectures series for the Public Domain Review and is an editor at the Brooklyn and Berlin-based Cabinet magazine. He is the author of a number of books and essays. I'll pass over to Graham. Thank you. One last thing. This event is being streamed on YouTube and will be archived at the Paula Cooper Gallery Studio website.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Terrence, and thank you all for coming out. It's great to have such a warm room and to see some friendly faces out there. And I would just like to say what a special pleasure it is for me to have this opportunity, not just to talk about a book I really admire and into which we will dig over these next 40 to 50 minutes. Thank you. Speak into the mic more. Okay. How about that? Are we good? Yeah. But even more so just because it's such a pleasure to be here with this human who hosted me beautifully at the BGC back in the day, where he created a really special intellectual community and whose work has meant a great deal to me over the years. And so both as a friend and a colleague, it's really fun to have this chance to talk about this stuff. So to get started, I think I would just like to do a mini version of what I did when we first met up just an hour ago and say, tell me a little bit about kind of how we get this at this moment from this person.
Right, so you did say we had, 45 hours? But before I start, I just want to thank Terrence and 192 Books. For me, sitting here, it's not quite deja vu all over again, but I go back to thinking of Books and Company, where I grew up intellectually when I was in college and afterwards. And there are so few places left that resonate with those kinds of values. And so it's fantastic for me that we're here now. But we're not all here. So I want to call out right at the start Luc de Rijk, who is not only the genius who designed this book, but was also the person whose perspicuous questioning actually called it back into life after the project had a long dormancy. So I'm really grateful to him. And I know in Ghent, it's early in the morning. So Luke, if you're watching, thanks for staying up. The other person I want to thank who's not here is my daughter, who went from being a character in the story in the first part of the life of this project to being the person who, at its end, designed the cover, and especially the poster on the inside. And in between, she taught me a lot from work that she had done on her BA thesis about the nuclear landscapes of New Mexico, to think about environment and how environment is a way of bringing together people and ideas and politics. So I want to thank her. And then I guess there are two other people. The first is my mom, and I say in the end of the book, this is the first of my books that she won't be around to read. And the other is Graham's, who lost his mom a couple months ago. So I want to just begin by kind of dedicating all of this to the mothers. The book came into being, as I said, it had this weird gestation, kind of like pictures who have a wind-up that begins and then has a pause in the middle that sometimes is designed to draw the base runners off base so they can be picked off. And intellectually, that was a little bit true for this as well. It began as a kind of very simple approach to maps as representation, even representation of the unconscious. So how do different Europeans represent their nation without or when they don't think about it? But that ended up, as for me, those kinds of projects invariably always do, in a kind of dead end and very quickly as well. And then it kind of just stayed in the back of a drawer. And every so often I would open it up, like the way I guess if you had a large wine cellar full of things that you looked forward to drinking but didn't know when or how. And so I would look at the maps that I had clipped out from these newspapers and then just put them back in the file folder. Until Luke asked those questions. And then it became a different sort of project that actually harnessed a lot of the things that I had been thinking about in between. And so as a historian, I have always taken the rigors and the discipline of working with evidence very seriously, but I have also always been really interested in thinking about how the things we can learn from that kind of rigorous process can actually be then taken to engage with conceptual questions, philosophical issues. So there's always been that kind of multi-level aspect of my work, sometimes more, sometimes less visible. And this book, because I knew it was weird, and because I no longer worried about whether people would think I was weird, I just decided to write something that was intellectually very serious in a kind of very personal but also experimental way, and never thought that I would be sitting in a room full of people who actually cared about what I had written.
You know, that allusion to the where the book started and where it ended up, I began tapping my phone to find that incredible Foucault quote about an experience book. So I don't know if some of you may remember that late in his life, Foucault makes a distinction between scholarly works and experience books. And he, in a sense, it's almost a question of late style. It's like you have to have lived a certain amount to make an experience book. And the maybe the best way to summarize what you just described as having begun with a project that was going to do history of cartography, a subject dear to my heart because that's what I did my dissertation in, like history of science cartography. So when Peter wrote and said, I've done a book on weather maps, I was like, okay, I'm ready for that. You know, I know what to do with that. But in fact, what you've really done is an experience book, and maybe we can try to unpack what that might mean as we talk. So I imagine very few people in the room have actually had a chance to read the book. So part of what we need to do to get going is to set up a little bit what the book tries to do. And maybe rather than having me sketch that, why don't you take a first pass at sort of letting a room that hasn't probably mostly gotten to hold the book get a sense of what's in this kind of slimness that's so rich. It starts from weather maps, but ends up having enormous ambitions concerning the nature of historical explanation, the nature of historical experience, historical consciousness, and even the nature of historical understanding, what it would mean to position ourselves in as beings in time. Give people a bit of a sense of how you think the book is.
So I think I would try and answer that kind of a question briefly by saying that the one discovery, maybe the discovery, the first of the discoveries in the book, for me was that we could think of weather as history, not as the background to history, not as the reason why this or that army experienced this or that thing, but that weather was itself historical. That's to say, there were agents, whether we call them temperature or precipitation or wind or pressure, that did things to other agents that in a process that unfolds over time, which is not so different from the most abstract definition of history. Once I thought about that, then I thought about weather maps not as something that tell you what to wear when you get up in the morning, but that are telling you a story. Then, by looking at lots of newspapers, so there was a research phase where I looked at lots of newspapers. There's interesting questions about which newspapers have weather maps at all. But within that category, what was interesting was that maybe 25% at most had two maps. There would be the sort of the local map, whether local was characterized in terms of city or usually nation. And then there was a second map that was usually much smaller, though it covered a much bigger territory. And that had the lines of fronts and highs and lows. By the way, the whole terminology of weather maps was invented by Norwegian meteorologists just after the First World War and completely adopted the language of the Western Front for the language of weather. So that's just a side factoid. But that second smaller map that covered a bigger territory was all about pressure. And it was, the other really interesting little fact is that most of the newspapers that had that second map were on islands. UK, Iceland, Hawaii, Japan, Hong Kong. When you start to think about it, it's easier to understand why, because there are no weather stations, let's say, to the west of Iceland, or to the south of Iceland, or to the west of Hawaii. If you want to know what your weather is going to be, you need abstraction. You need these maps of sort of planetary phenomena, like a weather system, precipitation, pressure. You need that in order to understand what's coming. So once I started thinking about these two different maps and their relationship to each other, you quickly understand that the pressure systems, highs and lows, are what drive the local weather, right? So there's the macro scale drives the micro scale. Well, to a historian, that's the main question of history. How do big events or things that affect many people, large-scale phenomena affect individuals. And if you wanted to, you could write the entire history of historiography, let's say since the beginning of academic history, in terms of that question and how different schools and individuals fall out on that. So once I realized that that was the case, then you think about the history of weather maps in newspapers, which is where the whole thing started. But as the great German theorist of how to do history, who I talk about often here, Johann Gustav Droysen, points out, history happens forward but is written backward. And that's true here too. The newspaper weather maps were at the beginning of this, but only at the end did I realize that the value of newspaper weather maps, once you understand that weather is history, and once you understand that the relationship between those two types of maps is narrating the central kind of drama of professional history, then you understand that the newspaper weather map actually presents that drama to more people for a longer period of time than any other historian ever, right? So in effect, the newspaper weather map has been, for all of these years, out there showing people how to think about their life in time without anybody ever realizing it.
So just because that reconstruction of what the book is about privileges a certain both historiographical and archival and conceptual line, just faithful to the book, I want you to feel its experience book qualities by reading the first 2 paragraphs of the book, okay? Can I do this? Okay. We live our stories. And in these stories, there is always one silent, easy to overlook accompanying character, the weather. Think of any memory. Think of any memory. How often is it also inhabited by one or another of weather's faces? Sunny, cloudy, hot, cold, dry, wet, bright, dark, windy. Sometimes the weather forces itself upon us as the lead, for instance, in the story of surviving a flood or storm or a heat wave. But most of the time, weather is the supporting actor, not calling attention to itself, but always alongside. It was like that for me once upon a time. It was a bright but not hot late summer Sunday. My wife and I decided to take our almost 2-year-old out for a walk. I donned a backpack, and with her 27 pounds hoisted aboard, we strolled around Lower Manhattan and then across the Brooklyn Bridge. On our way back, my wife, standing with the World Trade Center behind her, snapped a picture of the 2 of us, my daughter squirming in the direct late afternoon light. And that picture is given to you there. That I remember the weather so clearly has to do with what came after. The next day, Monday, September 10th, 2001, was my daughter's first day of preschool. And the day after that, Tuesday, September 11th, from that very same spot, the 21st century began. The book is definitely interested in the historiographical problem from which Peter began. Agency, causation, historical explanation. How to gear together different scales, which is what's at stake in the account he offers of these different kinds of maps. Maps that depict giant movements of forces, and then maps that show you whether you should bring your umbrella or wear a scarf. But the book is centrally about experience, which doesn't map especially easily onto sort of any of those other armatures. And while it's absolutely true to say that you could tell the history of history by accounting for how different theorists and practitioners of history have worked the problem of scale and agency, you could also tell the story of historiography by worrying the absent presence of experience. The sort of existential phenomenology, the inhabitedness, which is always missing once you've produced one of these representations or seen the problem from outside, regardless of the scale. So I give you that as a question. Like,
right.
In the end, this is a book, as I read it, that's haunted by the way history is not good at working with experience.
I mean,
What would you say to that?
I would say, first of all, great question. I would say that I'm going to give you the clever answer first. And I would say that just as in the conceptual approach, which is the abstraction is kind of how I think, it's about gearing the micro to the macro. Let's say the line of force in this book is about gearing experience to conceptualization. And I think I'm reticent. I'm uncomfortable with the confessional, but I am also uncomfortable with, as you point out, the professionalized evacuation of the personal from scholarly work. And here I have always in my ear A.B. Warburg's description of himself as a seismograph of souls. What he meant is that he felt that he grandiosely perhaps felt that he embodied or was tuned in to, whether we want to call it the zeitgeist, or tuned in to experience in a way that made his understanding not just his, but also that of his era. For me, what I think of, how I try to put that to work, is I would say that the historians, and maybe by extension to other fields in the human sciences, the historians' greatest, almost always untapped tool is their selves, and how to use yourself, your experience, as a tool for understanding, which again is that gearing of these things that are really incompatible, but how to find a way to take your own experience, understand it in such a way that it could then be mobilized as a scholarly instrument alongside of, you know, the archives and the books, etc. I think that's sort of what I try to do here.
Yeah, so many kinds of questions there, and you know, people will come to these questions from different places, but that idea that you use yourself as an instrument in the production of a certain kind of knowledge, it's a very fraught proposition in the human sciences, a phrase Peter also just used, because the dominant projects in the sciences across most of the last 200 years have involved not using yourself as an instrument at all. It's actually using an instrument as an instrument, because instruments aren't subject to the vicissitudes, the idiosyncrasies, the biases, and all the awkward stuff that gets called subjectivity. And so there's all that, which, you know, Peter knows super well. So to say, when I do this kind of human science, I think it's really important to think of using myself as an instrument, is already to say something pretty complicated and to call into question exactly what you mean when you call history a science, because you could also, as lots of people have over time, call it an art, a rhetorical exercise. And this gets quite vexed, a literary project, etc. But let's bracket that for a second and do another moment in the text, just so that you can keep feeling what let's get the book in the room. Is that okay? Yeah. I'm inside it now, and it is a physically nice thing. I'm going to say a word about that in another moment too, so it's nice to hold. In newspaper weather maps, we're asked to make the move. We're being trained, perhaps, to make that move between seeing the world with ourselves at the center and displacing ourselves so as to look at the world from somewhere else. Just as the larger and smaller scale weather maps are geared together in a complicated way, so our ability to switch lenses or perspectives is equally complicated. One may be introduced to it in school via such banal phrases as learn to see the world through someone else's eyes. But it's much easier said than done. A lifetime study might not be enough. We learn this most effectively, wait for it, we learn this most effectively simply by getting older. Looking back on what we believed or thought years ago allows us to see ourselves not just from a distance, but as participants in a wider historical phenomenon, something we could not have perceived in the unfolding of our youth. Even that Sunday walk over the Brooklyn Bridge feels different now. Looking at the photograph today, this gives me goosebumps. Looking at the photograph today, I can feel what it was like to be at the center of one story and simultaneously just an infinitesimally tiny part of a much bigger event that was slowly unfolding, unbeknownst to me or anyone else at that very moment. So I have things to say about that, but why don't we hear what you have to say about that?
Well, I'm going to answer, I suppose. The question is really trailing from the question about experience. And I think that's right. I think it is a difficult thing, as you point out, to bring yourself in as a tool for understanding. And yet I think the attempt to always be objective, to purge all subjectivity, makes it very difficult to get at parts of the spectrum of human experience. And so there is an element of what I was trying to do that that blurs some of the differences between a scholar and an essayist, or a scholar and an artist. There are each of these, let's call them stances vis-a-vis experience, offers certain kinds of opportunities and excludes others. And so what I was trying to play at here was trying to harness as much as I could from these different approaches for the purpose of understanding. And I'll have to say, I felt liberated enough to do this because I had written a lot of books with footnotes before, and because and this is also part of the experience that Graham's referring to, and because I didn't really care what people would think of me for writing this. And that's because, in a way, I had, in my work on Peiresc and the history of antiquarianism, I worked for over 25 years on a way of thinking about the past that was not only made obsolete by the development of modern historical practice, but was made obsolete so comprehensively as to become invisible. And I think, aside from what I learned from doing those projects, I also became very comfortable with spending time in in an unrecognizable intellectual landscape. And so in a way, this is not so dissimilar from the work I did on Peresque, which by the end of it, in the last book I wrote about him, was also a very experimental form that did not try to fit in with the ways books on obscure 17th century scholars are written.
At this moment, I can't resist slightly ribbing both of us, which is to say, why some people feel that they need to write 3 heavily footnoted books with scholarly presses in order to be permitted to have an immediate relationship to the real, as if somehow, like, you know, you shouldn't even attempt that until you've stacked a few tomes on the shelf. That's like a special question. What happened to us? Because there's like a shit ton of people out there who never, like, they just feel like they can go ahead and like be present.
So this is the question that Graham said he wasn't going to ask, but I'm so glad he did.
I said there was we may get to the question I said I wasn't going to ask, but that's not quite it yet, but fair enough. No, fair enough. Which is only to say there is one way to read this book as the hard-won and distinctive trace of the trajectory to the feeling of historical consciousness, which isn't the same as any amount of achieved scholarship on antiquarianism, any amount of successful explanatory work around the French Revolution. And I don't, if before it seemed like I was being sort of snarky about that, let me make sure that I'm clear. It's really different to arrive at that question of immediacy from having worked these questions of explanation and the like problem of the factical in the way that someone who's done the kind of work that you've done, you know, has. It is different. I want to make sure that that's clear and that I feel that. Does that feel fair?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I would say, you know, had you not offered this kind of nuanced answer, I would have said something like, I don't think it's the case that it's a matter of punching a clock, that you punch the clock enough and then you get a freebie.
For sure.
That's not it. I think it's much more, Marina and I went a few years ago, I think, to a concert in a kind of community garden near us where there was a guy from St. Louis whose parents were members of the St. Louis Orchestra who went to some island in Japan, I'm sorry I don't remember the exact one, to a Zen monastery where he learned how to play a certain kind of drums. And he had to work there for 6 years or something before he was allowed to go and perform. And I think that that's more like what I was thinking about, that a life in discipline, let's call it that, creates dialectically an understanding of freedom that you don't have if you don't have the discipline. So, you know, maybe in an alternate universe, there is somebody who could have, you know, just written this book without having spent, you know, a lot of years in discipline. That's possible. But I actually don't think so. And I guess that's really, you know, I think, and that's, you know, I don't want to speak for any of the artists in the room, though I'd love the conversation afterwards. I think there is something there. It's a little bit what I said before. How do you take, harvest, adapt, you know, the best of different ways of approaching reality for the purpose of maximal understanding? No,
I'm sorry.
yeah. I guess,
That phrase maximum understanding or maximal understanding is exciting to me because, earlier you said the question was to make oneself a kind of tool of understanding. And I almost want to like asterisk that phrase and put a little question mark in the margin because, in Truth and Method, Gadamer makes this like very powerful observation, which is that understanding is always an event. The event character of understanding needs to be emphasized. Knowledge is, you need a funny metaphysics and a funny epistemology to have knowledge be an event. But understanding is an event. It happens to people in time. It doesn't happen anywhere else. Knowledge you can actually sort of stack up in like a database. In fact, it's one of the inflection points of our moment that it's even hard to draw an especially robust distinction at this point between knowledge and data, especially with a dean or a provost. And that's why I think understanding is like actually a key term for anyone who cares about the humanistic tradition. Anybody who cares about why you might sit with a book and read it, or even just watch a movie, frankly. Anybody who doesn't want education itself to be nakedly instrumentalized and made to serve finance capital would do well to like sit with the term understanding because it happens to people. And it happens in specific times and places. So that's a way of saying, I don't really think you can be a tool for understanding exactly. I think one can only understand. And this book is an experience book because it bodies forth understanding. It sort of shows that happening. And how understanding works with knowledge is just the most confusing question of all. And that one I don't have I feel like I know some stuff about understanding. I feel like mostly my work these days consists in defending the category of understanding from being swamped by the alienated work of knowledge production. So I feel like I'm frankly a little tired of people explaining to me how much work it is to make knowledge. But you've made a lot of knowledge, and I think you still are pretty into that project. Like, maybe you're not as far gone as I am on that. Could you help me out?
I mean, it's going to sound boring to invoke Aristotle, but I think all humans do want to know. And, maybe different people have different appetites for knowing. And maybe people have different appetites for being free also. I mean, to go back to that sort of the metaphor of being in discipline, some people, need to be in discipline longer to eke out a slim book of maybe art, and other people might not need to be in discipline that long to produce many works of art in any number of forms. I think, if there's a freedom, and there's a part of this book that is intensely about freedom. It's how the book ends. It's kind of the takeaway, if one wants to be reductive. I mean, how much of one you need to be free is a question that can only be calculated on an individual basis. I needed to do what I did to get to doing this. Graham didn't need to. He got to the art sooner. But it's different. I mean, every person has to get there, and it means different things to different people.
We were talking as before we came here, and there's this lovely catchphrase that the French philosopher Michel Serres uses, and he's just being kind of dramatic, but he says, the work of being a philosopher is to first be a historian and learn all the history, and then forget all the history. And it's that the philosophy starts in the forgetting of the history. And I do feel like there's a version of this story that's like coming out of discipline produces certain effects.
I mean, there's a reason why in so many traditions, religious traditions, certain kinds of knowledge are only permitted after a certain age, right? And that's not so different from what Sarah is saying.
Age matters in this book, and in the section that I read, you felt that, you have to get older to start to feel what that could be like. And that was one of the most moving aspects of the book. Maybe there's a way of feeling historicity that is only possible once we are ourselves documentary and archival. When you're old enough that you actually have some history in you, and then what it is that you're talking about when you're talking about history out there lands in a different way. Do you think that's a true characterization of one of the kind of wisdom dimensions of what the book is after?
I think there's an element in this book, hopefully pretty suppressed, of institutional critique of my fellow guild members. I do think it goes back to the whole question of experience. It goes back to a question of how the book is written. I think it's a suggestion that things could be different. They don't have to be this way. I mean, I've said elsewhere there's no reason why every academic book has to have 8 chapters of 10,000 words. So there is something of that in here, a kind of suggestion that work could be done differently.
Is this the right place? And we have maybe 5 more minutes or so, and then we'll go to the floor for some questions. It feels like this is a very exciting point to kind of widen out. I hope you've gotten a bit of a feel for what makes the book so interesting and so engaging. We don't want to forget there's a bunch of weather maps in here too, but you actually run an institution now, and you ran another institution. And as we were discussing earlier, it is arguably sort of game over for the kind of humanities in a higher education setting in important ways. End of long-form immersive literacy is a bad blow when you care about the inherited textual tradition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how to do it differently and keep it going, and where and how, is an actual question that you can own in a way and have an effect on. So if this book is a kind of critique in certain ways, and if it opens onto the experiential as an experience book in that Foucauldian sense, is it possible to what can we do to institutionalize this? I actually see a graduate student or two with whom I've worked in the room, people studying the humanities, who care a lot about what institutions are going to look like over the next 40 years, where you might read Droysen, for instance, or something like that. Should we take a second on that? Because I bet there are some people here who care about that kind of stuff.
Sure. I mean, I think I have for a long time always thought of running institutions, to borrow the phrase from the great historian of the Italian Renaissance, Jacob Burckhardt, the institution as a work of art, and to think about running an intellectual institution as an intellectual venture, as an experiment, as a process, rather than as a fixed entity with the goal of passing on that fixed entity in exactly the same way when one is done. I have a more open-ended sense of possibility, and I think it's like with learning itself. If you think about it, and this book is a good example, learning is about taking risks, and it's a bit paradoxical, isn't it, that the institutions that are supposed to represent learning live the idea of never taking risks, right? There's something there to puzzle over. So I completely believe in the value of the humanities and of the arts, and as an institutional leader, and despite my own kind of pessimism, I don't submit to any pessimism. And I think, what's exciting about the place that I run now is, by virtue of the accident of its formation in bringing together artists and scholars, it actually has the possibility of constantly reinventing this sort of equation for different contexts and different needs. And therefore, it has the possibility of engaging with the changing world in a constantly dynamic way, as opposed to being a conservative venture behind its high walls.
Really, so powerful, so powerful. And I'm especially proud that two of my former students were in the academy this past year, so that gives me a warm feeling that you're at the helm of an institution and thinking of it that way. I'm going to say a few last words and then we'll open it. My last words are basically just about my own experience of reading this book. So you will see that actually my own copy is itself weathered. And that's because, as one or two people in this room know, just like Marat, I read in the bath. And I read in the bath with a window open directly. So I read this in the winter, in an extremely hot bath, as a wind blew across the bath of hot, steamy air, which boils up all around me, kind of like, and at a certain moment, I confess I slightly lost my focus, did not fall asleep, but just like reaching over probably to get an olive to go with the Negroni I frequently drink in the bath. And at that moment, the book got dunked. And then it had to be dried. So it was a whole kind of like, and for those of you who remember the end of 100 Years of Solitude, which is somewhere on these chapters, right, where you're turning the pages and you're experiencing your own destiny being read, there I was in the bath with the swirl and the immersive book and watching, of all people in the universe, Peter Miller, high humanistic, wissenschaftlich dude of all, sort of going full on kind of experiential on me, and I was tripping. So I strongly recommend that you grab the book, and if you were like me, you'll have an experience like that, and it'd be pretty groovy. So join me in thanking Peter, who's a hero.
Thank you, Graham.
And I think we have time for some questions, right? Yeah, before you get to have his ink in your copy and buy many exemplars for your friends. In the back, maybe? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. It seems to me that the weather maps of today are caught up in a larger story, climate change, right? Where every day we're looking at the weather, we're fitting it into that context. Are there historical parallels for sort of a larger meta storyline that the weather maps were in communication with? Or is that something that's kind of new to our scientific, future-oriented world today?
Right. Yeah, that's a lovely question. So I guess, right. So the question is whether weather maps are a new phenomenon or whether there's older ways in which the issues of climate have been presented. I think, weather maps and newspapers are obsolete, right? Nobody gets their weather from a weather map anymore. We get it from one of these. And the weather that we get in one of these is much more detailed than we can get in a newspaper's weather maps. So the first thing I would say is that working on newspaper weather maps now is working on something that is a fossil twice over, right? That's the first thing. The second thing I would say that makes newspaper weather maps unbelievably acute is that newspaper weather maps came into being as a result of railroad and telegraph. That's what enabled data to be compiled such as to produce these things. And the book talks a little bit about how that unfolds in the middle of the 19th century. That's to say, the Florowit, like the historical lifespan of the newspaper weather map, corresponds exactly to the period in which we human beings have ruined the climate of the Earth, right? From the 1851, the first daily weather map at the Crystal Palace exhibition, to now, right? That whole period is the weather maps, the newspaper weather map is both a product of the Anthropocene and its daily documentation. So for the historian of the future, if they ever exist, or the historian on another planet, if they exist, they will be able to reconstruct the entire downfall of the climate that existed for 10,000 years before 1851 on a daily basis from newspaper weather maps. They will go from being not only a fossil twice removed, but the kind of trivia that in their heyday people never thought about intellectually. They will go to become the most important evidence on Earth for this phenomenon.
Yeah, and just to throw in on that, I would say that there is a fascinating story of the emergence of climate as a historical object separate from weather. So there are interesting kind of straight history of science books on the history of meteorology, which is these problems of prediction and so forth. Katie Anderson, Predicting the Weather. These are kind of like archival books on the disciplinary project of meteorology and weather prediction. But you'd go a totally different place to historicize climate, meaning these larger scale patterns of weather behaviors. And for that, that's hugely tied up with evolutionary history. Darwin, discovery of fossils, the recognition that in specific geographical regions there were totally different flora and fauna. So biogeographical reconstructions permit people to see that weather had changed at a structural level across time and was itself historical, and that's the emergence of climate, which is definitely kind of haunting us at this point. But there is a 19th century story to the history of climate as well.
If I could just jump in, I would say that climate is sort of the reputable subject. Climate is real, climate is substantial, climate tells you the truth. Weather is like the disreputable younger brother. Weather is random. One swallow doesn't make a spring. Weather is random. Weather is non-predictive. Historians love climate and dismiss weather. And
I'm sorry. No, you finish. Yeah. I'm sorry.
No.
That's terrible. I'm horrible. I'm sorry.
And so my espousal of weather is also part of a kind of polemic that I have against big history, against the history of structures, the history that relegates the human experience to mere froth on the waves. And I would just like to ante that up a little bit more. I don't talk about it in the book, but there's a way in which weather is crucial to a kind of thinking that happens now. So the founder, some of you may know this, of chaos theory was a professor of meteorology at MIT, Edward Lawrence. And he, out of his failure to be able to predict the weather scientifically, to build an algorithm to explain and predict weather, comes up with chaos theory, comes up with the butterfly effect out of the same articles about weather and its unpredictability, and becomes a crucial building block in modern complexity theory. So in a way, I would make the argument that there is, if you think about these big pendulum swings of concepts, there is a way to argue, yes, climate is changing and we're all doomed, right? But the sort of the renaissance of weather in complexity theory can be sort of domesticated by all of us in very constructive ways, because it actually comes to grips with, I would say, the granular character of human experience in a way that climate cannot, because climate is about averaging things out. And we don't live in averages.
You've got a couple of real historians up here, which is that like blah, blah, they like know all different kinds of random things that are really important. So I was just going to add that like if you want to go fully sort of philological on the notion of climate, it of course refers to klima, the parallels in geography. So it is cartographic originally, and what makes it structural exactly in the way that Peter has evoked is that you know there's going to be a whole weather universe depending on how far north or south you are. So if you're in this kind of latitude, it's not just that it's going to like rain on Wednesday or not rain. It's going to be cold all the time. That's a climate situation, if you see what I mean. So the idea that climate was distinct from weather because of this geographical structural feature of the Earth precedes its historicization, its timeliness, where you begin to be like, there was a little ice age, or England used to have palm trees and this kind of stuff, which is a kind of a 19th century thing. Let's get another question in here from the room. Yeah.
I'm wondering, is there a limit to the personalization of history in the sense of, reading the New York Times, for instance, however you may do it, reporters have to inject, I arrived late because the subway was busy or something along that line. I don't know, there's a lot of, is there some limit to the amount of the injection of one's personality, personal life into history? And if there isn't, is your next book going to be a memoir?
Well, I was going to say, I think the limit is personal. It's a question of taste. There are many people. I mean, it used to be the case that, as Graham pointed out, personal was never part of kind of scientific production in the natural or the human sciences. It's become much more common. There are people who do a lot of it. Each to their taste. If you like it, that's fine. I don't like it so much. I do it for effect, sort of like the way people drop F-bombs in lectures for effect. I think it can be useful to inject the personal. There's a kind of credibility, aura, accessibility that can be useful heuristically to do. But to me, no, I'm not. I would say the one place where I think it's actually important, not so much in narrating story, but one of the things I try and do very explicitly here is talk to the reader. And I think, breaking that fourth wall with the readers, the author speaking to the reader, it's like, Fielding or Lawrence Stern, right? That kind of speak to the reader. There's something really valuable in that we, preserving the kind of interrogative character of learning in a printed book is, I think, a really great thing to aspire to.
Let's do one more from the room. What's on people's minds?
I have a strange association, and as I heard you speak and those amazing opening lines, and just the way that the weather map is portrayed in this started reminding me more and more of those livers of the animals sacrificed by the Greeks, or the sediment of the coffee at the bottom of the cup of a Middle Eastern grandmother, as a form of maybe a almost divination, almost looking into the future.
Absolutely.
And I was about to say, am I crazy to say that, or?
No, the meteorologist has haruspex. I love that. I think, prediction, if weather is like the disreputable younger brother of climate, I would say prediction is the black sheep in the house of history.
Yes,
But the interesting thing, there have been a lot of studies that the Decatur projection maps, geographic maps, all depend on, again, the subjectivity of the person who drafted it. Weather maps, interestingly enough, even with the issues of predictability, are perhaps the only maps we have. Solar system maps changed over time, but weather maps are weather maps. Mm-hmm. So these are the true facts and the only true maps that exist, one could argue.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'll end with my favorite newspaper weather map, which was, it's in the book, which was published for a while. I don't exactly know how long, because though I am a historian, I haven't devoted that much historical Sitzfleisch to this particular challenge. It was a projection of Europe that was published in the Roman newspaper La Repubblica at the end of the 1990s. I know they did it in 1998 because that's when I came across it, and I know they were no longer doing it in 2001 because I was looking for it when I did this book, bless you. And a lot of European newspapers, they have their national map, and then they have a map of Europe, and they all do it slightly differently. La Repubblica managed to tweak their projection of Europe, okay? Just weather maps are not fixed. Weather maps, I'm going to hold you in suspense for a little bit. Weather maps are like technical illustration, right? And therefore they have the illusion of objectivity, a little bit like Portolan maps in the Middle Ages. That's sort of the analog to it historically. Anyway, in La Repubblica, they used a projection of Europe that was tweaked so that somehow they managed to fit in the upper left corner of their map of Europe, New York City. So that's my favorite newspaper weather map of all time. That's like a true wish image.
I'm going to give you last. We'll end on Peter's own words. I'll read one more short passage from the book, and then we'll move to signing and so forth. And I will say it's very interesting. Folks in the audience who've written a book will know that you kind of let a book go at a certain point, and that process of distancing yourself from it after you've written it is part of letting it be in the world. And I must say, as a recent, very close reader of the book, I have immensely enjoyed sitting with you and discussing it, and feeling interesting ways in which the book could kind of even come and keep getting you in certain ways. Like in answer to the question about, is there too much personal? What's the limit to the personal? And you're kind of, you use the personal efficaciously. It has a certain rhetorical effect. That's not exactly what he says in the book, team, because he actually gives an answer that I think in some ways is almost truer, because there's no limit to the personal for you because it's your person, of course. And that's like a really powerful thing always to remember. And so the question of how the personal goes into any particular discourse out there is a separate question. And he hits that point so hard here on page 18. Here we go. Are we to dismiss utterly the small scale, whether of a single day or a single life? It is, after all, our scale. If the weather is history and the weather map is its visualization, newspaper readers around the world are given a daily opportunity to struggle with one of the most difficult challenges of historical work, making sense of the relationship between the world as individual experience and the world as a general process. Join me in thanking Peter.
Thank you.